All right, so we're picking up today with the putting out system, and this is just a means of subcontracting work. They were putting out goods. This means that work was contracted by a central agent to the subcontractors, usually the rural poor, who would complete the work either in their house or a workshop nearby with other craftsmen. And so this was actually used in England and in American textile industries, in many different kinds of industries, but especially with textiles. This started with there were several rural farmers who, facing the difficulties of the enclosure movement, needed to supplement their income because they weren't making enough money with their agricultural goods. So they decided to give the putting out system a try. So the cottage industry just consisted of manufacturing with hand tools in peasant cottages and sometimes work sheds, and this really grew to be one of the main features of the European economy during this time, and it was done through the putting out system, which again, the merchant would loan or, quote, put out raw materials to the cottage workers who would process the raw materials in their homes and then return the finished products to the merchant. The putting out system grew mostly because there was a large number of people who were unemployed or underemployed and they needed more money, or poor peasants, landless laborers who were willing to work for low wages, even lower than what people were making in the cities. The putting out system also grew because they didn't need to meet guild standards. The cottage industry became capable of producing all kinds of goods just because they didn't have to meet the rigid guild standards. So they produced textiles, housewares like forks and knives, gloves, clocks, instruments, tapestries, luxury goods for the rich like fine porcelain. But all of this was done in the putting out system. Another, aspect of the putting out system is that it involved the whole family. Because this was done many times in the home, the male or the father of the home would do the actual spinning and weaving, and sometimes the wife or the woman, but the children would take a role in this as well in helping gather supplies, really just assisting the father in anything he needed while producing these goods. And so, sadly for guild members, the putting out system, the cottage industry, resulted in the decline of guilds. Even in a time like in France, where we talked about Colbert in France, the great economic planner, had kind of tried to stifle the growth of this industry because he wanted guilds, because guilds produce quality products. But the poor living there had to find a way to make money. So he was forced to lower his standards and just go with the putting out system because there were so many people who lived in rural poverty. So rural manufacturing developed unevenly across Europe. It was best developed in England, where by 1500, half of England's textiles were being produced in the countryside. And by 1700, English industry was more rural than it was urban, and they were relying on the putting out system. So it developed best in England, and then, of course, more slowly in the continental European countries. So what was it like to be a rural textile worker? Until the 19th century, the making of linen, woolen, and eventually cotton cloth was the industry that employed the most people in Europe. So this was a majority of the people in Europe. The rural worker usually lived in a small cottage, hence the cottage industry. The cottage usually had small windows and very little space, and the space that they did have was taken up by the weaver's loom. Another aspect of this is that this was, like we've already said, this was a family business. The operating the loom, that was the most important job. That was reserved for the male head of the home. But women and children worked at the secondary tasks, so preparing the threads, winding threads on bobbins, and sometimes operating the warp frame while the father passed the shuttle. So in the same way that family working together was necessary in agriculture, it was necessary in the textile business as well. Another characteristic of a textile worker's life was that the employer/worker relationship was usually very tense. And a lot of that was just because the boss or the merchant who had put out the raw materials for the family to complete had very little control of what was going on, because this was done in the family's home and they weren't there to supervise and they weren't there to direct. And I think they bitterly resented their lack of control, as their livelihood depended on the cottage workers' ability to meet these orders on time. So most of the cause for problem was deadlines weren't met, or the merchant would accuse the family of poor quality work. The family would accuse the merchant of not giving him enough materials. But either way, this was a tough relationship. Another factor here is that conditions were harsh for all rural workers, really, but especially for women workers. And the textile industry wasn't an easy industry to work in. In our book on page 642, there's actually a picture of the linen industry in Ireland, and the women are pictured with these sword-like things beating away the woody part of the flax plant so that the man can comb out the soft part. And it was just a lot of labor anyway, but it was especially hard on women because the wages were especially low. So the Industrious Revolution describes the social and economic changes that took place in Europe in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And this is not to be confused with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrious Revolution preceded the Industrial Revolution. So the years we're talking about for this are about 1600 to 1800. So households in northwestern Europe reduced the amount of time that they spent on leisurely things and stepped up the pace of work dramatically. And many of them even redirected the labor of women and children toward wage work. So this led to a rise in female employment. While the cottage industry continued to thrive in rural areas, like out in the countryside, in the cities, families pushed their children and their women out of the house and into the workforce. And as a result, females usually wound up in jobs where they had menial tasks and received low wages for them. This did, though, give them a greater role in the home, because for the first time, many of them, while they weren't the breadwinners, they were bringing in some provision for the family. So even though they were forced to take these low-paying, tedious, monotonous jobs, they did receive usually a greater say in the home and what went on in the home. And so this created a household where all members worked. The children, the mom, the dad, everyone worked. One of the consequences of the growth of the rural industry that came about through the cottage system was that the traditional guild system that protected urban artisans was undermined. I think we said in the previous slide, though, an exception to this was France, and their leading economist, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, revived the guilds because he wanted quality products, and he wanted to collect taxes off of those high quality products as well. So guild masters in Paris received exclusive rights to produce and sell certain goods They received exclusive rights to raw materials and the right to train apprentices and open shops. Guilds also served social and religious functions. One of the restrictions that was oftentimes placed on guild members was that they had to be good Christians. In addition to that, they had to have several years of work experience and at some point have completed a masterpiece before they're admitted into the guild. But they provided a chance to socialize. And especially for middle-classmen, this was something that really hadn't happened much for them outside of the guild. So the guild did provide some type of close-knit society for middle-class people. Critics of the guilds said that guilds were outdated and they were a barrier to progress. They believed that technical innovation and progress could not happen if Europe continued to allow these guilds, which were strong, especially in Germany. And guild restrictions were different in each nation of Europe, but like I said, really strong in Germany and in France for a while. Guild masters did, though, adopt new technologies, and they found creative ways to circumvent impractical rules. And the guilds were able to reinforce potential buyers' confidence in the goods that they had purchased through these new technologies. And in some instances, guilds were even accessible to women. And that was pretty much restricted to textile guilds that specifically involved needleworking. One of the most well-known critics of government regulation of trade or industry was Adam Smith. And he was a professor of philosophy and also a leading figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. His most important work by far was the inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, and most commonly that's just called The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. And Adam Smith, the thing that he's known for is free trade, trying to eliminate government restrictions on trade. And so he was a heavy critic of the guild system. He thought that their restrictions were impractical and inhibited a free economy. Adam Smith argued that the government should be limited to three things. And the first one is defense from foreign invasion. They should have to protect the people from any type of foreign invader that might come in and wreak havoc. He also believed that their job was to maintain civil order with courts and police protection. And the third one was he believed that the government should sponsor public works and institutions that otherwise wouldn't profit private companies or private business owners. He believed that the way to improve living conditions, which in some places in European cities were wretched, was to have a competitive market. And he believed that if you had competition, then you would have improved living conditions. Adam Smith sometimes gets a bad reputation because people see him as an unbridled capitalist, that he believed that businesses should be able to do anything that they want to do without any type of government restriction. And that is not the case. Smith's ideas were considerably more complex than that, and he even criticized the deadening effects of the division of labor and called for government intervention to raise the workers' living standards. So Smith's work inspired not only domestic reformers, but also independent merchants around the globe who campaigned against the monopolies of colonial empires and called for free trade. And I will leave you with this lovely picture of our economic liberal hero, Adam Smith. And one of his famous quotes, it says, "Labor was the first price, the original price, money that was paid for all things. It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all wealth of the world was originally purchased.